All right.
Perfect. Am I
Hello,
audible?
everyone. Welcome to the exhibition round for National University Debating Championship 2020. Thank you for all of the speakers for consenting to be recorded and be a part of the accreditation test that will take place next week. The motion before the House today is this House would require prospective parents to obtain a license as a condition to have children. To open the debate, I would like to welcome the Prime Minister. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, as a child who is born in a household with a physically and verbally abusive mother and an absent father, I know damn well that becoming a parent is not an inherent right that belongs to everyone, but it's a privilege that you need to obtain and you need to earn it, ladies and gentlemen. This house believes that a government should be able to regulate and decide who can have a children and who cannot based on several mechanisms. What we propose here that we have a mental assessment towards prospective parents. So if you want to have a children, you need to undergo an assessment first. What we're going to look into is first history of anger management issues. Secondly, openness towards changes or opposing views. For example, sexuality, religion, standard of success, definition of what a desirable work field is, etc. And then history of domestic abuse in that household. If for example, that household has a history of where the husband is physically abusive towards the wife. And then secondly, the parents have to complete parenting classes provided by government, and they need to pass the minimum score. And then we're going to also have a mechanism where we will be able to revoke their license once there's been proven that there is a abuse that's happening or they're unfit to become a parent. And we'll also willing to give a license towards some people that failed at the first hand, but the second round they able to prove that they are fit to become a parent at the end of the day, because we acknowledge the fluidity of human nature. The world where we're going to impose this is the fiat that both sides need to acknowledge that public facilities is adequate provided by government. For example, education, healthcare, and then foster care is there, right? Ladies and gentlemen, we see a world right now where there is a massive cases of abuse towards children, physical, verbal, and mental abuse. We see children getting beaten up every day. We see children being mocked by their parents, said that they're stupid, that they're an idiot, and they're fat, and they should not exist in the world, ladies and gentlemen. We also see a world where there's unrealistic restrictions towards your children, where there's an unrealistic imposition of standards of success by their parents, especially in Asian community, where they demanded to when it's a boy, they have to be straight and act manly, and when they're a girl, they have to be submissive and girly. Our goal here is simple. We want to minimize those abuse. We want to minimize those atrocities. And because everyone is not born to become a parent, it's not an inherent trait. In my speech, I'm going to bring up several principal justification. Firstly is why the government is the one that's fit to standardize who can be a good parent, and then why it's justified for us to punish it. Why is it
POI.
justified for us to impose a standard prior the parents having a children? Why this needs to be preventive measures and not a curative. No, first, let's talk about why the government has the right to standardize who can be a good parent at the end of the day. First, I think the most important duty of a government is to protect their most vulnerable actor. And we think that the main demography of a vulnerable actor is children, ladies and gentlemen. Most of the times when they are facing hardships, they are the one that is left with the least protection. because they do not have the economic power. They do not have a position in society where society believes in them, ladies and gentlemen. Because oftentimes the society perceives them as someone that does not know enough and easy to manipulate. Therefore, their position is severely vulnerable. And we, as the government who has the resources, needs to step in and protect them at all costs, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, we believe that government is the only body that exists that has enough power and resources to gather and crunch the existing data to be able to generate a list where you can at least say that these are min category of you being a good, what is constitute of a good parent at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen. And then thirdly, we think that when someone is born, they become a member of the society at the end of the day, right? But here's the thing. Uh, uh, a world where people are starting to have children, there's a burden of the government has a burden of it, because then there is this collective action that's happening, because suddenly everyone wants to have a children, and since not everyone is fit to become a children, this requires a regulation. Secondly, let's talk about why this is have to be preventive and not a
Before
curative
that,
thing. No, the harm of having an abusive parent is way too big, ladies and gentlemen. The impact that you're going to have when you're raised in a household that is not fit to raise a human being is a lifetime sentence towards someone. I still struggle with commitment and having a close relation with other human beings, because I distrust people that much, because I fear if I trust someone and let my guard down, they're going to stop beating me up and then using my words against me. I still fear when people raises their voice, because it reminds me so much of how my mother used to raise her voices at me and beat me up until I bleed, just because I break the plate, ladies and gentlemen. I still struggle with massive insecurity, because my mother used to tell me that I'm fat and I'm not smart and I'm not worthy living, ladies and gentlemen. I still carry this burden even though I have no longer lived with her for 3 years. Those harms exist and it ingrains our identity, ladies and gentlemen. So we do not think waiting until these atrocities happens is when we can move, ladies and gentlemen. We need the government need to step in before all those atrocities happen, because the harm is too big and we cannot have that. Just like we do so many preventive measures at the first place for terrorism attacks, even for driving, ladies and gentlemen, we do preventive measures to that. Why can't we do another preventive measures for something as impactful as a family unit? We are very proud to propose.
We thank the Prime Minister for that speech. To open the case for the opposition, I would like to welcome the Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Okay, thank you. Wait, let me set up my timer. Okay, so I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Panels. We think that in the status quo, yes, there exists cases of abuse, right? There exists cases of parents who neglect their children, right? But most importantly, there are also cases of underprivileged parents, for example, who work so hard for their children. Underprivileged parents, for example, who against all odds manage to raise their children to become good people, and so on and so far, right? And we think that those are the things that we should fight in the status quo, right? The equal right for everyone to have children, and in order to ensure that everyone has the right, every single person has the right for happiness, for motivation, which I will explain later in my arguments, right? what do we stand for in opening opposition, right? We say that everyone should have the right to have children, regardless if regardless if they for example have regardless if they have inherent parenting abilities and so on and so forth. And that is exactly why we think that 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 we should not limit these people's abilities to have children by insisting that they have to gain a license in order to have children in the very first place, right? All of my rebuttals will be intertwined in my speech, right? So what am I going to say in my speech? I'm going to tell you two things, right? First of all, I'm going to tell you why it is not justified, why limiting people's abilities to have children is not justified, and secondly, I'm going to explain to you why it's exactly going to be bad if we force people to pass a test before they can have children, right? So first, why it is not justified? 3 points, right? First of all, you limit the rights of your people, and secondly, you do not allow your people, you do not allow your citizens to grow in your citizens to grow. And secondly, we say that the status quo is progressive, right? Moving on to my second point, you limit the rights of your people, right? We say that having a family, having children, for example, is the source of some people's happiness, right? But they think that life is so difficult, they have to work every day, is so difficult, to have to face hardships in life is so difficult, that the only way that they can be happy is when they are with their family, right? When they are with their children, right? When they hold their babies for the first time, for example, when they have to when they feed their babies, when they stare at their baby's face when they sleep at night, and so on and so forth, right? That's exactly why we think that the moment that we no thank you, the moment that we limit no thank you, the moment that we limit people's right to be we limit people's right to be to have the children, that's exactly when the moment that we limit one of their most basic rights, which is to live a good life and a prosperous life, right? And secondly, let's move on. Oh no, thank you. Let's move on to my second point. Why this does not allow your people to grow? We think that parental abilities is not it's not instinctual, right? It is something that you need to grow. It is something that when you are 15, for example, you did not think that you would want to be a parent, for example, but when you have a kid, for example, you love your kids so much that you are willing to learn, that you are willing to become a better person for your children, for example. That is exactly why the moment that you limit these people's rights to have children, you limit them to become a better person, right? You limit them to gain the parental abilities, right? Because parental abilities is not something that is inherent. You are not born you are not born loving babies, for example, but you grow to love them, you grow to want to raise them to become a better person, and so on and so forth, right? And lastly, we said that status quo is progressive, right? Right now people are already thinking about their eligibility before they have children. Are they mentally stable? Are they emotionally stable? Are they financially stable, for example? They know how heavy a burden is to raise children, for example, how expensive it is to send them to schools, how expensive it is to spend money. No, thank you. Spend money for their necessities, and so on and so forth, right? We said that this works both ways, right? Either those people who are privileged, those people who live in good cities, in urban areas, for example, and also those people who live, for example, in less developed regions, for example, they're going to be too busy, for example, thinking about whether they can continue working or not, whether that they should stabilize their economy first before they can have children, and so on and so forth, right? We say status quo is progressive also in the form of that there are existing mechanisms in order to tackle abuse, right? That there are punishments for people who abuse, for example, that they can go to jail, that you can report them, that there is social judgment, and so on and so forth for these people who are abusers, right? And we say that exactly when if you want to protect children, exactly if you want to extend your protection to all of the children, no thank you, I do not accept your eyes, exactly why you need to enforce these mechanisms instead of creating a new one, right? Exactly, you need to enforce the existing mechanism of for example, sending people to jail when they abuse, for example, so that you can protect everyone, right? of a government's mechanism only protects those who are, for example, who only protects those who have not been born yet, only protects those of the future generation, for example. Meanwhile, if you enforce the status quo, if you, for example, if you enforce the laws for abusers, for example, you can protect the people who are being abused, and you can also protect the people who are going to be abused in the future, right? And for those reasons, we think that exactly it is not justified for the government for the government to force people to take a license before they can have children, right? Now let's move on to my second argument. Why is having children so important, even for those people who do not seem like they deserve to be parents, right? So for example, in the best case, right? Like for example, people who are previously bad, for example, people who are previously poor, people who would not pass the test, for example. We think that yes, maybe children are unexpected for them, right? But we think that sometimes children are what motivates them to be better, right? Children are what motivates them to work harder, for example. Children are what motivates them to be gentler, for example, exactly because they love the children and that they want to provide a good life for their children, right? The moment that you do not allow them to have children, you limit them to become a better person. You limit them to be able to provide for someone who matters so much for them, right? And that is exactly why we think that we need at the end of the day to allow these people to also have children, right? And comparatively, what's going to happen on our side of the house? People are still going to grow. People are still going to get better at the end of the day, and that if we strengthen the current mechanisms instead of creating a new one, we think that that is going to be able to protect the current generation and also the future generations from abusers and neglects and so on and so forth. And that is why we oppose. Thank you.
We thank the leader of the opposition for that speech. We would like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Hi, hello. Audible?
Yep.
Yep. Oh yeah, video. Sorry. Okay. Hi. Setting up my timer. Minum dulu. Panel, if opposition bench believe that it's a right to have children, a world that they need to defend is a world where individuals who are sterile by lottery of birth needs to be given children by the government. That's the burden of proof. Because that's not status quo. Status quo, we allow biological parents to have children. But when a person is sterile, they need to adopt. And when they adopt, there is a certain restriction. There is a certain requirement for them to fulfill and in order for them to be able to adopt children. What they need to answer, why it's okay to have the different requirement when individuals have biological children, it's a comparison for a sterile person to adopt a children. I think that's a world that opposition bench needs to defend. Two clashes in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why requirement is important and why that's particularly fair and what's the role of government in these certain situations. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why post facto revoking licenses, punishing individuals to go to jail isn't necessarily enough, and that's not how government works at the end of the day. Before going on to my clashes, yes.
What will you do on your side of the house if a mentally ill person gets pregnant accidentally?
Yeah, in that situation, we are okay with abortion. That happens in a majority of the case. When a person, for example, already got pregnant, we're okay if abortion is what they want to pursue. So let's talk about accessibility here, right? I think opening opposition strawman our requirement. How would they say it? They say we are being discriminative towards underprivileged parents who are poor, for example, and cannot access our requirement. I think Noni never said that financial capacity would be one of the metric for us to give licenses, because we already also concede that in this situation when they are not financially capable, it's okay because they can still send their children to free healthcare provided by the government. They can go to free education. So financial capacity is not our reasons to discriminate. It's not our reasons to block their requirement and block their licenses, right? I think that's the kind of characteristics that we want to pursue. Especially, I think this is very important to say that mental health, mental assessment, and something like that is actually a fair characterization and fair metrics. Is exactly because opposition said that individuals, when they want to have children, they are willing to learn, right? In this situation, I think opposition technically believe that individual can get better, right? I think if a person, for example, is rejected of this license the first time, according also to their logic, these individuals could learn and become a better person prior to having children and applying the licenses again, right? But what's exactly worse on their side of the house, right? Because they say that the willingness to learn and the motivations to be better comes from the children itself. When they already hold the children, when they already hold the baby, they becomes more caring persons. I think this is a huge gamble, and I think this kind of person is actually a bad person at the end of the day. Why? Because what they fall in love with is not the idea of having children, but physically this particular children that they think that they own now. They fall in love with their new property, their new belongings, right? I think in this certain situation, these individuals would tend to be loving only to a certain conditionality of what the baby looks like right now, right? I think these are individuals who, to begin with, is insincere when they love these children at the end of the day. They are not ready. The fact that they don't pass the mental assessment in the very first place, but they can be loving. I think these are individuals who love conditionally. So in certain situations, for example, when these children obey them, these people would tend to be more aggressive again, and therefore would have the anger management issues again, right? But okay, let's talk about what if this certain parameter that we set isn't fair and isn't accessible, and people cannot grow themselves to fulfill this requirement.
Point.
I think that this is still actually okay, right? Why? I think government doesn't work in a way that they guarantee accessibility. I think most of the time government works in a way that are pragmatic to reach their certain goals. What do we mean by this? Let's talk about driving licenses. Sorry, Daryl, I take on one POA. Let's talk about driving licenses, right? When we talk about driving license, we work on the basis that there is a possible of collective harms. So I think that it's easy to equate this because there's a possibility of collective harms that occurs whenever a car crash, that it harms other people. The same thing could be analyzed with having children. So whenever a failure happened and the car, which is this case the children, causes problems, these are collective harms. So I think government always prioritize the pragmatic interest over accessibility. We know that it's harder for poor people to get driving licenses because it's hard for them to get a car to begin with, right? And when they do, for example, drive other people's car, we still require them to have licenses because the collective harm is too big. But secondly, I'm also going to use the driving license analogy for my second clash. Why we cannot do post facto? I think the proposition coming from opening opposition is that we do a post facto punishment. So when people already do the harm, then we can punish them by revoking their license and put them in jail. The first problem with this is that I don't think it's mutually exclusive. We also are willing to do that. We want to punish people when, for example, they already get their license and they grow out of the character and they become a worse person. We all punish them when they attack their children, right? But the second thing is this, right? I think the burden of team opposition is to argue why government never works in probability, why government only works in giving a requirement in an absolute condition that the deed have been done, the post facto. I think it's possible for government to work on the law of probability. If you drive a car without a license, it's not a death sentence. You could possibly survive. You could possibly not hit everyone, but that's still prohibited by the government if you don't have the license, because the probability of you crashing a car if you don't have a license is higher, right, than people who already owns the license. So I think this is how the government works, because the data sets are available and there's a possibility of you calculating the probability of chance that is going to break or not, then government could do this. But most importantly, I think, is because the harms is irreversible towards the individuals itself. Not only the collective harm, but it harm towards the children itself is irreversible. So at the end of the day, post facto, you punish this individual after, but you don't necessarily prevent harm to happen to begin with, then this person is permanently scarred and personally traumatized, and we don't want to happen. We think this analysis is important as the debate. That's their burden to prove otherwise. We beg to propose.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. We would like to welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close the opening half of the debate. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Madam Chair, I think opening opposition thing models from the opening government is that still blurry, right? On how their models coming from OG and on how they have listened and so on and so forth, but they don't clearly explain if that someone or individual that not having license and then they have the case of accident of having children that we have in the status quo, they are being punished or not, because we think it will going worse under their side of the house. Because let's take a look on the status quo itself. In the context of readiness to have children, sounds good and convincing, right? To label someone ready with this license. Meanwhile, we know not that's the reality. That first parameter of being ready is to abstract, right? And second, we know how that having children is like basic need, and and the option on everybody to have children, because they know when they have children in status quo, we can see on how hard the burden to have children is itself. In status quo, we know the existence of a lot of people that afraid to having children because they know how hard the burden it is, right? So we say this listen, we think it's so unachievable in their side of the house, ladies and gentlemen, and it's so blurry models under their side of the house. That's what OO1 is, that all layers of people have equal right to having children, because we think status quo is progressing, like we have this sex education and we have KB that government provides. So these prospective parents also have they kind of incentive to being ready, ladies and gentlemen, because we say under the side of the house, these license only can be accessed by the privileged one, and we say it's not justified, right? Like my previous speaker that already say to you, because we don't consider what privilege can having children, because it is their right too, Mr. Madam Chair. So I will give two things in my debate. That first, why with the existence of license, it will harm the perspective of parents, and second, which side that will bring better situation in status quo. That first, they say this license is so good for them to have like incentive to learn, to have this underprivileged have willing to learn. We say it is knowledge, and gentlemen, this license is not make them have a willingness to learn, because we know the context on the poverty in society who in poverty condition, they easy to searching money for themselves, and gentlemen, and so on and so forth. So we say they not willingly to learn. Meanwhile, under our side of the house, how they got readiness itself, ladies and gentlemen, but not from license, we think, because in our side, when they already have children, that is stigma and environment that force them to learn, ladies and gentlemen, how to grow their children, and so on and so forth. And they know the burden when they have children, so they will taking their kids going to school, and so on and so forth. Because in our side, government already already give the help, right? Like like welfare and so on and so forth for them, like scholarship for them. In Indonesia, we have dignity and so on and so forth. So we think in our side of the house, we do not limit these people rights, right? In their side of the house, with the existence of this license, it will very limit their rights, ladies and gentlemen, and it's very significant of the country itself, because the country itself will not have a good inheritance, ladies and gentlemen, because we cannot say the good inheritance, like good future generation, only coming from the privileged one, right? We also acknowledge, ladies and gentlemen, there's underprivileged people also that willingly to have children, ladies and gentlemen, and we said to prevent the overpopulation itself, we still have a status quo under our side of the house, ladies and gentlemen, with the existence of KB and so on and so forth that government already provides. So we think in their side of the house, it will be very, very worse, ladies and gentlemen, from the country itself to develop, ladies and gentlemen, because they will lack of generation and so on and so forth under their side of the house, right? Meanwhile, under our side of the house, it will be so much betterment, ladies and gentlemen, because we have a lot of generation that can be potential, because we have a status quo itself that helping them for grow, and we can prevent overpopulation that with the proposal that with what happened in the status quo, like KB and so on and so forth, right? And in privileged people one, we think it is very hard to, ladies and gentlemen, for them. It is very hard because we think this privileged one nowadays don't have incentive to have children, because they know very hard to having children, right? So they will not have this incentive to have license and so on and so forth. But even if they have, we think it is just a little amount of number of society, ladies and gentlemen, and we think this is so bad for the country itself to develop, ladies and gentlemen, in the end of the day. So we say this proposal coming from government is so bad, ladies and gentlemen, and why we say this license is so harm for the betterment of these prospective parents itself, that they have option, and for the country itself, because this country need to develop too, right? So, and coming to my second substantive, we said that will bring better situation in status quo. Let's compare what happened with children, what happened with this society, right, that have license or do not have these models of license and so on and so forth, right? So we think in our side it will be better, ladies and gentlemen, because if they say the existence of toxic parents and so on and so forth, like the case of abusive, we have a counter, right, in the status quo on law enforcement and so on and so forth. In the side of the house, it will be very bad, ladies and gentlemen, because this license will limit these people, right, that do not have that capability enough in the very first place. Meanwhile, they can still learn, ladies and gentlemen, after they have children, right? And we say we still have preventive too. In the parents also, in the parents level, it is very bad, ladies and gentlemen, for them, because they do not have right in the first place to decide, ladies and gentlemen, this they want to have children or not, ladies and gentlemen. So we say this is very bad and not give the better situation in the status quo if we run with government bench proposal. Under our side of the house, it will be betterment, ladies and gentlemen, when we stick in the status quo, we spread sex education and so on under our side of the house, and it will be so much better under opening opposition work. So vote for opening opposition. Thank you.
We thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech. To continue with the closing half of the debate, I would like to welcome the Member of Government. Here.
Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. We on the closing government, we are going to give you new context on why then this has to be, that this problem that is already existing in status quo, on how there is children that is abused, on how there is children that live in poverty and they cannot get out of the cycle of poverty. We are going to give exclusive reasons why the government has to fix the problem with this motion, and not other mechanism like increasing the quality of and quantity of existing mechanism in status quo like welfare programs. Now, in status quo, we already have mechanism like social programs and organizations to protect children. Yes, we already have that. And just because we are going to implement this motion doesn't mean that we are going to abandon those mechanisms. Instead, we will keep on those mechanisms, but we will take this additional measure to make sure that those welfare programs wouldn't go into waste, that these resources that the government already spend so much money on will not be just a waste. Because, for example, you give food coupon, but these families are so poor and they have too many children that they cannot increase the quality of their life. And that's why then we think that social welfare programs can work better on our side of the house. And another exclusive reason why it has to through this mechanism where we create a license as a qualifications for parents to have children is because we have to see that the government are operating on limited resources, right? And the country has so much problem that the government has to take care of. We have to still build infrastructure. We have to still take care of how our healthcare programs have to be able to cater to everyone, on how we have to create massive job opportunities. And there is already so much on the government's plate that they have to balance, and that the government also have limited resources. And we also see on how then the poverty rate is very high. There is existence of slum areas, and that's why as a government we need to use those resources responsibly. Because if, for example, the unqualified parents decided to have kids and those kids grow up to be like the parents cannot get out of the cycle of poverty, so these families will be the one that the government has to support, right? The government will have to spend their money on it. When they are sick, they are going to use the healthcare system. And government will have to provide food coupon or subsidies for these families. And that's why we differ from our opening government, in which then we give additional context on why then we have to also take a pragmatic approach on how then we just don't have the resources to be able to protect everyone. But before that, yes.
Why is it that the poor don't deserve to have their generation continue living, and rather needs to stop just because they're poor, and when it's usually the fault of the government that they're poor?
Okay, so the opposition team have been saying that everyone should have the right to have children, and that they are going to protect both the parents and the kids. But I'm going to tell you why it's okay to limit parents' freedom, even the underprivileged parents or the poor people. First, we think that these parents, for example, when they make the decision to have children, even though they know that the children will not have a good life, that the children will have to still be stuck in poverty, on how the parents know that they might not be able to provide opportunities for their schooling. I mean, when these parents make the decision, they already have sufficient cognitive ability, right? Yet they make the conscious decision to have children when they are not capable of becoming one. However, the children itself, they don't get to choose, right? And that's why then we choose these children to be the vulnerable actors that we have to protect. And that's why on closing a government, it's why we believe that it's okay to not give those underprivileged parents, for example, the right to have children, because it's a trade-off we are willing to take than the massive harm that is going to happen if those parents instead end up they have children, and how the children instead will suffer, right? The opposition also brought the arguments on how then these children is actually a source of happiness for the parents. My response to this is that children is not a thing with the sole purpose to make parents happy. Their existence is not for the satisfaction of parents, so that they feel like their life have meaning, because these children already have a life, also have a life that we have to protect, also have a life that we have to fight for, that we cannot get them to be abused, that we have to we have to be able to provide them with education, with proper food, with nutrition, so that they can have a good life, right? And that's why the opposition team has to say first why it's okay to sacrifice the children's happiness for their parents, when children is already the vulnerable actor here. And also the opposition might say that parents can still learn after. However, when parents learn after, they are going to have or been casualties, right? And we cannot afford that, as I have stated before, because these vulnerable actors, they are still in the development, right? They don't have developed cognitive abilities, they don't have safety nets, they cannot provide for themselves, and that's why we have to take care of them. And also, I'm going to give you additional benefits that is different from the opening government, on how then we can actually make the countries be better. Now, we think that we can reduce the workload of the government so that our resources can be allocated to other sectors, for example, infrastructure or creating job opportunities. And that's why welfare programs can only happen successfully on our side. And we can stop the cycle of poverty, because these parents may not be able to get out of the cycle of poverty, right? That these kids will grow up not getting opportunities, they cannot get private tutoring, so they cannot get in prestigious university. They grow up having to help their parents work. They sell stuff on the streets. They have to work instead of getting their rights to play as their age. And the overpopulation and existence of slum areas, where there is a high level of criminality, where the sanitary is really, really bad there, and the access of clean water is hard, on how criminality like drug cartels is very apparent there. And all of this is because the overpopulation, and because how poverty is, and how poverty is still happening there. And that's why then we think that it's okay for us to limit these parents to have their children, because if they say that parents have the natural incentive to be better, we don't agree, because in status quo, if that's the case, then all parents should be perfect, but that's not the case. And that's why the government has to step in, so that those parents that are not qualified will not be able to have children. And for that reason, we are proud to propose. Thank you.
We thank the member of government for that speech. We would like to welcome the member of the opposition. Hear, hear.
One second. Okay. CG is keen, or CO is keen to protect the two main actors in this debate, women and children. Before I move on to my two extensions, two strategic mistakes that's been made by the entirety of the government bench. Number one is that OG gives you example of abuse in various Asian cultures or developing countries, but in the same speech and in all the speeches in the government bench is that all of them assumes that the government is fit to standardize parenting, not setting the country, or at the very least, types of countries that we're going to talk about or that we're talking about becomes very destructive for their case. Because if we assume that we operate in the developed world where government welfare is already robust and children are already protected through things like abuse laws or emancipation mechanisms, then we don't need this policy at all. But if we operate in countries whose welfare is severely underdeveloped, then I don't see how we could, or a world in which the government don't just channel those resources into things like education and enforcement of abuse laws, and how the same government could be capable of standardizing a parenting license, right? But second strategic mistake is that Gov's side don't recognize the status quo. I'm actually struggling to see the nuance in Gov case and how that's different from status quo mechanisms. The only thing that's been thrown around are things like welfare without really acknowledging things like emancipation laws or laws against abuse or laws that would require you to have legal guardianships. All those things I will talk about and becomes pivotal to our case. Let's talk about the two main extensions. Number one, I want to talk about women and the violation of bodily autonomy. Later on, I'm going to talk about children, the efficacy of parenting. This will directly respond to CG's extension. So first, let's talk about the violation of bodily autonomy, or women specifically. I don't understand the stance that OG and CG took, that they care about the vulnerable actors in society, but limits that vulnerability to children or unborn people, but neglect the vulnerability of women, parents, impressionable teenagers who never got proper sex education in schools, etc. When I asked a POI early on, what would you do if a mentally ill person or someone who didn't pass the test to obtain a license accidentally gets pregnant? The answer was very insufficient, that they're fine with abortion. I take this to mean they will force an abortion on someone who is mentally ill. Understand that abortion is something that's incredibly traumatizing to some women, or to most women, even if it functions as a personal choice and even if it's 100% consensual, right? Imagine how much more traumatizing that would be if they're forced into this by the state. Not just that, but forced into this under the premise that they're mentally unstable and therefore unfit to make personal choices about their bodies. These are likely women who aren't doing so well in life. These are likely women who won't be able to pass the test in order to obtain the license. These are the women that will be forced into abortion. You exacerbate that even Furthermore, by violating their right to make decisions, no thank you, of what to do with their womb, and you force them into further mental turmoil under your side of the house. But understand the importance of this extension, right? The point to which your efforts to protect one group becomes an incredible violation of another group, that's the point at which a policy is really not worth pursuing. Further, we'd also argue that protecting unborn future civilians preemptively is far less important than protecting your own citizens whose already developed consciousness and are already legally deemed legitimate citizens. Before I move on about how we protect children more on our side of the house, I'll take a point, sure.
Okay, how do individuals who cannot make consent under your side, oftentimes is they resort to guardianship where their parents decide. Why their parents can decide for them, but the state cannot?
Okay, guardianship is like one of the many examples that I actually gave to you, right? If it was true that someone who is, or like an impressionable teenager gets pregnant, decides to keep the baby and does not, and proves to not be a suitable parent later on in life, then there are mechanisms like the state being able to provide resources like welfare, like the state being able to actually enforce things like legal guardianship or something like aiding that that teenager. And I think somewhere down the line, that teenager or that mom or the parents, whoever, would probably realize that what's best for their kids is something that the state can deem. But right now, what I'm talking about specifically is abortion. It is not talking like taking away the children or something like that happens way later on and has a lot of legal mechanisms to it. But right now I'm talking about bodily autonomy. I'm talking about specifically enforcing abortion on a woman, right? Second extension then, I want to talk about why the efficacy of parenting is more feasible under our side. This will directly respond to CG's points about parenting. Why do you get more effective parentings on our side? For 4 reasons. Number 1 is that the government will strain the ability of parents to actually be able to cater to specific children. We don't think there's a one and all way in which parenting is effective. There are some standardized things such as parents not being allowed to abuse, in which things like emancipation laws, in which things like abuse laws actually exist to counterbalance that those things that could be standardized, right? But some things just simply cannot be standardized. These are things that are specific to individual families whose goal is more so than child survivability, but also things like growing a child's passion and expanding their avenues to self-actualize. These are things that could be obtained from teaching your kids of different cultures, etc., that are simply different in every culture. I take personal offense that Gov would issue a blanket statement that Asian culture is abusive, because although it does not fit the cookie cutter Western definition of parenting, Asian-style parenting do actually give children some avenues to self-actualize differently. Coming from a typical Asian household myself, I actually start to appreciate the way in which my dad accepted nothing less than straight A's in high school and college. Not only does that motivate me, it also, I think growing up in this type of household also allows me to find common ground with other Asian or other high achieving kids in both high school and college who grew up in that same culture of parenting, and allows me to appreciate that even more and find that community. The point is, there is another method of parenting in which that is perhaps more acceptable in Western cultures, but that does not mean that it is good for everyone. I appreciate the cultural differences in parenting method that gives me a sense of community to relate to, that gives me an additional avenue to actually self-actualize. Number 2 is that parenting is a two-way communication and adaptive to child's conditions. The reason that standardization cannot exist is because literally every child is different. Under your side, standardization means parents won't have the willingness to actually adapt the child's conditions. Parents are far more likely to be forceful on what they are taught, and we'd assume that standard curriculum is likely to be heteronormative, classist, etc. All the harms that OO would like to touch on. But this is incredibly harmful for, say, children who suffer from autism or requires social care, right? Or even high achieving children who aren't as socially adept, or children who simply mature faster or slower than the average person, right? Point is, it's a two-way street that cannot be standardized. Driver's license, as OG would like to characterize, is uniquely different because it truly isn't variable. A car is a literal machine, whereas a baby and a child is a human being with a personality, a conscience, and a life ahead of itself. Number 3 is that gov mechanisms assumes that issues cannot develop. We posit that you're far more likely to develop issues like alcoholism or mental strains, the point to which you're officially labeled as non-abusive, right? Passing the license presumes you're qualified, which gives parents far less incentive to better their parenting style. Gov assumes issues aren't conscious. They are and can develop, aren't continuous. They are and can develop later on in life. If a parent passes a test and down the line gets diagnosed with alcoholism because of extreme work stress, for instance, they're far less likely to realize the fundamental flaw in their parenting and the ways in which that could affect a child, because the government already gives them a green light saying they're already good parents. But fourthly, it's legal repercussions. This existence is likely to replace the legal mechanisms we currently have, like emancipation, like abuse laws, because there are the assumption that there's no need for them anymore. If parents are already having license, children's claims for emancipation is likely to be seen as the children being childish rather than the children furthering legitimate psychological or physical concerns. Very proud to oppose.
We thank the member of the opposition for that speech. To conclude the case of the government bench, I would like to welcome the government whip. Hear, hear.
Let me just get my timer ready, and let's move this here, move this there. Okay. Where is my first sheet? Okay, let's begin. A few rebuttals before I move on directly into my arguments. The first rebuttal is that we're going to rebut the opening opposition, which they believe that certain parents actually change, or that by having children, or that a segment of society actually think twice before having children. We believe that yes, society is progressive, but not all of these parents have this mindset of actually ensuring that they have the resources and the psychological readiness to actually have and raise children. And we also believe that this concept of being a good parent or improving oneself to be a better parent is itself inherently subjective, because as what we can see throughout this whole debate, that certain paradigms of being a good parent, whether it be being in the East Asian style of having high discipline or wanting high grades, and whether it be in the other styles of actually using your child as a form of child labor, such as making them guard your shop, is very subjective, and it's not necessarily will result in the same good things for the children in the first place. Now, moving on, ladies and gentlemen. We feel that emancipation can actually, or empowerment of certain minorities, and directly clashing with the argument of the opposition, especially towards women, can only come by changing the culture that is towards children in the first place. But what do we mean by changing this culture? In the status quo, what we believe that it has been forgotten by all teams, excluding my own speaker, is that people view children as a right in the first place. And why does that happen in the first place? Because people view children as a means to better themselves, whether it be in Western societies where your marriage is failing, the best solution that people usually have is to have children, or whether it is you're in poverty, your religious mindset believes that by having children, we can increase the wealth because God will somehow give us wealth by having more children. This creates a sense of entitlement towards parents that by having children, my life would be better. And therefore, parents actually demand to have children and not actually think twice as to how to best raise that children in the first place. But what does that lead to? It leads to children being seen as mere tools, as the means to achieve a betterment towards family life itself, where they force extra pressure upon the children because they count on that children to raise them out of poverty by getting high grades in school or in college in the first place. And that's something that we believe is not necessarily good for raising children in the first place, and can actually lead to more suffering. Moreover, this culture, this different mindset of raising children can actually negatively impact how a children is going to be raised, and the different social economic status of parents can actually negatively impact how a children is going to turn out in the first place. Children that are raised in not so privileged families may not necessarily have the same means as children who are privileged to actually have higher grades or to obtain placement in prestigious universities, which can then continue that cycle of poverty in the first place. So what my speaker is trying to say from the very beginning is that it's okay for us to take away the rights of the parents who feel that they are entitled to have children, just so we can protect these vulnerable parts of society, which are the children in the first place. What makes us as the closing government unique than the opening is because we have explained to you how the real world works. Unfortunately, we have so much funds that we can allocate. Even in the status quo of social equality and social welfare programs, we can only give out so much funds to people that need them. For example, in Bidik Misi, we can only penetrate a small segment of society. Or even in the United States of America, where we're talking about the stimulus bill, which actually helps a lot of people in the coronavirus, can only give up to so much amount and not a lot of amount. Yes, any POI?
How's your mechanism uniquely different from emancipation laws, other than the fact that it's far more presumptuous to parenting capabilities?
It's because, here's the thing. We believe that both can exist hand in hand. Emancipation laws are an action that is curative in nature, and we feel that preventive is something that we need to be done. Why is that so? As the opposition side, you have to justify why is it's okay for children to live with the scars of abuse for the rest of their life, when even as adults who are trying to overcome trauma in their life are having a hard time. What about children who are actually having a more hard time, are going to live a longer life than adults, and probably have to negatively impact how they perceive the world? So what we're trying to say here is you have to justify why the long-term suffering of children is something that is acceptable in your status quo, rather than us to actually assume that parents are not going to be good parents in the first place. Now, let's continue on, ladies and gentlemen. So what we're trying to say here is that children are not going to be raised equally, and that there's going to be different households. And therefore, we as the government need to actually shift this paradigm by saying that children are not necessarily a right, that it is a privilege, and you must fulfill these certain requirements for this privilege. But why is that a good thing in the first place? Because to directly counter their argument of providing lesser strength towards existing laws, providing lesser strength and autonomy towards women. It's because the reason why women are oftentimes being second banana in society is because they're only seen as a baby factory. And because the people that makes the choices are the fathers who feel that it is their right to have children in the first place. By shifting this burden away from the father and instead having the government have the final say as to whether or not you will have children, this will actually lower the ability of the father to decide when or when not they're going to have children. This could actually lower the ability of the father to actually create even more, to negatively impact the autonomy of their wives in the first place. Now, continuing on, ladies and gentlemen, why is our proposal the best way to solve both cases? As my speaker told you before, our proposal is not actually takes into consideration the limited resources that we have in the status quo. By taking a curative action, we can only do so much because we have, as we said before, limited resources. Instead, by preventing that action, we can then allocate that budget to other things that could positively impact or create a net positive impact towards society in the first place. Now, let's continue on, ladies and gentlemen. So essentially, because society itself, as my speaker told you before, society is facing a large conundrum of problems that require a lot of funds for us to overcome this problem in the first place. That requires a significant amount of resources, and unfortunately, that resources is being siphoned away because a lot of children are not necessarily born in the best scenarios. And because of that, we have to not only create infrastructure, we also have to allocate a lot of funds for the welfare of children in the first place. And the problem is, government can only interfere so much in the child rearing of children within the family unit. The government cannot mandate when your child has to take vaccines. The government cannot mandate how often they have to visit doctors or which schools they have to go to so they can have, ensure a better future. So even if we allow children to be born naturally without any restrictions, and we have all these social policies, not everyone who need that policies are going to actively use that policy in the first place. Some parents believe that by giving mental abuse, it's actually good for the development of children, and the children are raised to the point that they are going to accept this and not actually report it or contact any authorities that might actually get them out of the situation. Some parents believe that college is useless, and they're not going to focus their child on academics, or not even sign up for bidik misi. So even if we have all these proposals that are going to combat poverty and etc., because the autonomy of raising parents and the idea of being a good parent is still going to be based on what the parents think and not what the government thinks, the tendency of people to actually utilize these means of bettering themselves will not be as high as in our proposal. At least we can prevent one thing. We as the government believe that at the very least, yes, it may be their fault, it may be our fault that they're in poverty, but we cannot morally agree that we as a government should increase the amount of suffering that is happening within society in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, our arguments may be similar than the opening, but we explain to you how their impact is going to be more widespread. Thank you.
We thank the government whip for that speech. To conclude the case of the opposition bench as well as the round, I would like to welcome the opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Yeah, give me a minute. Yeah, start video. All right. Okay, everyone can see me and hear me, right?
Loud and
Yes.
clear.
All right, cool. Start my speech in 1, 2, 3. Let's stop talking about countries and societies that popularly disrespects and devalues children as just tools for them, right? Because in this case, it's likely that the government is not going to change the norm much, even if you put this licensing thingy. Rather, they would probably enshrine them as ideals in these licenses because it's such a popular thing and the people voted people who also believes in these things, like religious figures that also believes that children are supposed to be just tools for the expansion of the religion, so on and so forth, right? So it's unlikely that these things will change if that is the thing that is the problem that is identified by the government team. And this is also the general problem of both government benches, is that most of their arguments are principal arguments on equality by closing government, or protection prevention principles by opening government. That doesn't really matter in this debate because we all agree on these principles, right? No one made an attempt, however, to really mechanize how licensing actually makes parenting better. And I think that's what differentiates closing opposition as the best team in this debate. I'll talk about three things. Firstly, I'll deal with the principle. Does the government have the right to control women's bodies? And secondly, I'll talk about, is there one way of raising children? And lastly, does this policy actually incentivize better parenting? So firstly, does the government have the right to control women's bodies? And what OG came up as an answer is that yes, because we can punish someone prior to their mistakes when it's a collective harm that is irreversible. Also, it's because it's not really a death sentence. We're just taking away the license, so it's not really a really harmful punishment, right? So firstly, I'd like to argue that it's quite reversible, this thing, these harms that happen to children. Firstly, through way of direct communication with the children and parents, where they can talk it out and change the parents' behavior in the future, since I'm sure and most parents are acting in good faith as well and would most likely want the best for their child. But if it is really something that is super painful that the children have experienced, first, the children still survives throughout the parenting. So I would like to argue that the harm is not very harmful. But lastly, it's also quite reversible to things such as therapy that the children can also participate in. But we agree that most of the time it is quite harmful. However, the government don't have the ability to punish the parents still, because firstly, it's not the sole parents, the sole fault of the parents, right? Most of abuse comes from people who are super stressed out by the macro economy, by the fact that the government is not regulating alcohol and cigarettes enough as well, right? So most of the time, the government also shares a lot of guilt. No, thank you. But lastly, in regards to punishments not being severe, really, is it not severe? I think Stephanie's case highlighted how severe this will be to a lot of people who have accidental births, for example, who are now forced to do abortion, and also people who are people who are just taken away of their children and now have really bad relationships with their children, right? Not being able to fix that again in the future. And remember, this is prior to their mistake, right? Prior to their mistake actually being made. So first, you punish the children by killing them, and also you punish the parents without them actually making the mistake, but just guessing that they will make some kind of mistake. Then closing government came in and say, oh, poor parents are going to harm poor children. Firstly, I feel like this is an assumptive harm of the standard of happiness, because in many cases, parents who are poor rely on their tight-knit communities and those communities' resources to survive, like collective parenting. And oftentimes their children can be happy individuals as well. But secondly, we agree that this is a really problematic problem, but the solution is not class genocide and literally disallowing this group of people to have their generation continue, but is to give welfare to public schools so that these people can access education better, generally to make healthcare much easier to be accessed, and childcare to be something that is a free service. For example, if there's resources that can make this licensing and the accountability on these licensing happen, which is very expensive, I'm sure that these resources can be used on these things as well. So let's move on to the actually important stuff, the practical stuff, right? Firstly, let's answer the question of whether there's one way of raising children. No, right? There's multiple ways of raising children, and we're not talking about being abusive or not. No, thank you. It's also talking about just a diversity of ways to be a parent. Do you want to be? Do you want to dictate on what the children should learn, or do you not want to do this? The problem with licensing is likely that the government would streamline it to only one thing, because the government is too afraid to let freedom be something that the parents have, because that might in the future be something that the government is liable on if the parents make a harmful decision based on this freedom, right? So it's likely that the government will be very limiting in this and create only one way that the children will be raised. Before 6, I'll take the POI from opening. Hello? Rizky?
No.
Okay, so let's move on to the most important thing then. Does this policy actually incentivize better parenting? And I think that this is the most important question that we only answer, because if this license actually create worse parenting, then this license is in the same way useless as any other government policy, right? Most of the time, when you give a license, you are telling these parents that you are already excellent as a person. Then the culture that you make is that these parents would most likely feel righteous instead of being communicative with their children, right? They instead feel like they're already the best parents and their children should always follow what these parents say. That doesn't create an adaptive parenting for these children that experiences a lot of different problems than these parents experience, right? So you're likely to create this culture that is very dictative to what the children need to experience, and that is really bad for the children who don't feel like they can talk to their parents. But also, when previously the parents can be communicated with and can be consulted with, now the parents won't want that, because if they admit that they've been a bad parent and they want to change, then that is an admission of guilt. So they cannot communicate to the children, they cannot communicate to other parents to consult on what better things that they can improve on. Overall, this makes the parents a worse person because you make them a morally righteous person instead of a person that is open to change and communication. We're very proud to oppose.
We thank the opposition whip for that speech. And with that, this concludes the exhibition round of NUDC 2020. Thank you so much, all speakers, for participating. Yeah, and recording, Dre.